I'm delighted to introduce Rowan. It's a very special treat, Rowan, to have you with us today. Rowan's one of the most interesting thinkers and doers in this space. So we're really privileged to have you with us. Rowan leads the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Again, probably one of the most interesting, creative and productive institutions in this space that we're in. And the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network that Rowan runs brings together leading global policymaking institutions such as state investment banks, innovation agencies, citizen government departments to share the challenges and opportunities they face when trying to create and nurture public value. Before joining UCL, Rowan was a Director of Innovation at the Royal Society of Arts, the RSA, where she set up the RSA Lab. And prior to that, she's got 15 odd years experience leading a wide range of design and engagement processes, notably the community participation in the design process for the London 2012 Olympic Park. She finally also holds a master's in responsibility and business practice from the University of Bath and is currently a PhD candidate at IIPP. With that, warm welcome to you, Rowan, and over to you.
Thank you so much. It's hard to follow when someone introduces you so nicely. So I hope to live up to the promise of that. I'm going to share my screen, so let's hope this works. And as Danny says, I will share these slides with you later, but in the interim, I will have them. I hope everyone can see that. Okay, so I have had a long journey in trying to understand public sector innovation. And as Danny says, it has been both thinking and doing. And my current work is what we call practice-based theorizing, which sounds rather grand, but is fundamentally about trying to put ideas to practice on the ground in the public sector. So, but this long inquiry started, you know, as I was introduced. I worked in the public sector for a number of years. I worked in a range of government departments, and most notably I worked in London 2012, the delivery authority for 4 years, looking at how to deliver the design process, how to bring to life the design process that latterly became the Olympic Park. So from that experience, I was always very interested in trying to understand how to engage in an innovative way with the public sector. And so my research career then followed off this, or kicked off this long inquiry into the concept, if you like, of public entrepreneurship, which could sometimes be seen as intrapreneurship or the public sector innovation. It's a way of thinking about how to be entrepreneurial in government. I started this when I was at the RSA, so I worked on a series of different programs. And as Danny said, set up the RSA Lab, which was effectively a policy lab where we were somewhere between an observatory and an experimental space, working with action research to understand how to affect change in government. So the first report that we put out was a publication that looked at design thinking and how design thinking could transform itself into systemic change. The second one was looking at actually the core capabilities and competencies of public entrepreneurs, which was called Move Fast and Fix Things. And concurrently with that, I started working with Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who was at the time at Sussex University. And we started on a collaborative partnership where she then wrote this paper called Mission-Oriented Innovation Policy, which really piqued my interest into really beyond the kind of operational innovation, the inside government entrepreneurialism. There was also this how government can affect change through market shaping and mission orientation. And that took me largely over a course of, that was about 3 years ago. I've moved into UCL IIPP as she set up this wonderful department that does a range of different things. But fundamentally, our mission is to change how public value is imagined, how it's practiced and evaluated, so that the role of government has got public purpose in its central. So we're focusing on societal challenges as well as economic growth, and making sure that economic growth is more innovation-led, sustainable and inclusive. I won't dwell on what IIPP is, but it's a very different kind of department in that it has research and teaching. We have a master's in public administration, which looks specifically at innovation, looking at how to create the civil servants of the future. We have a series of academic projects which look at rethinking the role of public value and public purpose, and specifically the economics of public value. And then we have a public engagement program, which has a series of events akin to this kind of thing. But then we also have a kind of policy team and lab where we work alongside what is called the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network to understand this sort of practice-based theorizing, how to shape mission-oriented, public purpose-driven policies in institutions and how that really works. So we work on the ground with a number of public agencies. There are, at the moment, this isn't all of them, there are about 77 agencies, and they are from all over the world, and really their main, there is still quite a heterogeneous group. So it's not just public banks, it's not just innovation agencies or R&D funding. It is also cities, it's also different kinds of government departments. So this is a group of organizations that are interested in how to put public value central to their operations and how to think about mission-oriented innovation policy. But before I go into the detail of what we're doing in MOIN, and I will come to that a little bit later, back to the beginning of this journey, the kind of interest that was piqued. And I can't label a particular time that I started, that I wanted to understand more about how things worked in government and how you got new things done. Specifically, I was interested in getting new things done. I worked in the design team and then so the external design consortium as part of the Olympic Park, and effectively I went rogue and went onto the inside. So I became part of the staff in the Olympic Delivery Authority, and I found working in government extremely interesting. Like, how do things actually work? And there were a lot of entrepreneurial people in London 2012, people who were able to get things done. And this started, an ongoing interest and inquiry into who are these people and how do they get things done? I would say that there's a sort of typology of entrepreneurial mindset, which is that, broadly speaking, public entrepreneurs are problem solvers. They are bureaucracy hackers. So they get through to getting things done as opposed to working entirely to rule, although they're not lawbreakers. And that's a key thing that we'll come to later. They are opportunistic and attuned to external market signals. Now, those market signals might be signals about what's happening in the world or in society in general, as opposed to just economic markets. They tend to be passionate, ambitious, and motivated by the public good, so true public service values, but at the same time married with confident risk-taking and working out how to get around the system. And I did a big piece of work that looked at, if you like, the systemic immune response to change, and I'll also come to that a little bit later. Sometimes there is a kind of move towards positive deviance, which is about when you're trying to get things done, you take ideas to the edge of what's allowable. And we see that comes up a lot in what entrepreneurs or public entrepreneurs are. Increasingly, they're also adaptive and flexible. And we see this starting to get bedded in, certainly in the UK, but also around the world, in the new use of kinds of methods like agile methodologies. They do what is needed to get the job done, and they take a kind of very adaptive and agile approach. And they are networkers. They understand who the actors are in a particular system and who has influence, and they work out how to get things done that way. But what's the drivers behind the need for public entrepreneurialism? I mean, I think we can all probably agree we have not been in a steady state for a long time. And there are all manner of drivers of change that we can allude to. However, there are really some that really stand out as kind of hammering home the need to change the way we do things within the civil service, or the need for innovation in the civil service and in government as a whole, and indeed in broader society. The first one is, as we all know, the relentless pace and the massive potential of new technology. Now, the big challenge of new technology is really actually that so much is happening at the same time so quickly, and living at the speed of technology is extremely hard. So we're both trying to grapple with the adoption and adaptation of new technology, while at the same time understanding the potential of that new technology for to affect change. So we have a lot of new general purpose technologies, if you like, that don't follow the same linear track that these technologies of old did, you know, where effectively you sometimes had 100 years before the steam engine actually affected the kind of catalyzing of the Industrial Revolution, and then what that actually meant in terms of the next wave of electrification. So these waves are coming in tsunami speed, and there is massive potential, but we don't really have the time often to really consider how to use new tech. And she says not being able to actually move her own technology on. There we go. This is an interesting day to talk about drivers of change, being the fact that we're in a sort of transitional generational space as well. You know, we are seeing this polarization at play right now in the US, but I could have filled this is a very ugly slide, but I could have filled this with even more examples of polarities. We are, you know, at a generational transition, but it's not just a sort of, you know, I think the marketers would call it millennials versus boomers, but it's not just a matter of old power values and new power values, the kind of the linear and then the more distributed or networked. These things are true. With technology is forcing a lot of societal changes, but also there are lots of identity challenges where we're becoming much more aware of, you know, issues of social justice, issues of plurality, and they are creating big conflicts and driven by a ubiquitous social media that we're now all connected to all the time. This also really comes in, I think this is a really interesting, in the corner, the bearing point part of the slide, interesting kind of logics that then start manifesting, and specifically manifesting in the civil service in practice, which is the binary or the polarization between a regulatory mindset and a digital mindset, and how they come up against each other. You know, if a regulatory mindset is about protection, rules, law, risk management, and digital mindsets are about openness, you know, an open economy, transparency, connectivity, and ubiquity, how do you actually, you know, how do you marry those? And those are the tensions that show up in public service far earlier than they show up anywhere else, because, you know, public service is highly regulated. Oh, somehow I skipped past digital. I mean, this is not new, but it's an ongoing driver of change, the ongoing demand to do digitalization and understand what digitalization means in government. That kind of flurry of activity that started in the UK, certainly with GDS, and around the sort of 2010, 2012, the drive to change how digital was understood with gov.uk, which then influenced a kind of the world in terms of how we understand pretty well, public service digital. It's an ongoing challenge to ensure that everything is accessible thoroughly in a digital way, and that it's focused around user needs. So this concept of user-centered design, this concept of digital first or digital by default, has become a mantra that we all need to work with, but that you still have a lot of legacy systems. I don't know if this is the case where you are, but it certainly is the case in many agencies that I've worked in, is where you have a real lag in terms of the system's capacity to be as digital friendly as maybe even the staff and the user needs are demanding. So, you know, there is always a struggle to be able to create a consumer grade interface while actually trying to work with legacy systems. And then there are these bigger macro drivers of change, and these are not just macroeconomic drivers of change. These are, you know, most neatly culminated in the Sustainable Development Goals or the global goals, but they are the combined challenges of, you know, public health, of clean water sanitization, of climate change, of inequality. You know, these are the big picture that are about securing the future for for generations ahead of us, and they are and should be, I would contest, central to the work of all public servants, even if they're not in their existing day job. And then there is COVID. So what I'm talking about today is really how to enable kind of public entrepreneurialism based on these drivers of change. You know, how to cultivate a public entrepreneur mindset for yourselves or in your work. And I hope to have a conversation with you all, which I may not have the answers. I'm very interested to understand more about what you do and how you operate in your different landscapes. But we are all currently focused on COVID-19, even if it's very much at a distance, and the only thing that it's changing is how you operate in your home as opposed to in your office. So but it has been a fundamental driver of the need for innovation. Many people have referred to it as a kind of as driving, you know, 5 years worth of change in 6 months. And I want to explore a little bit about what being a public entrepreneur in an era of COVID really means. This is a paper that has been released by Mariana Mazzucato and Rainer Cattell, who are the directors at IIPP, and it was only launched today. So the link is in the slides and you can have a look at it yourselves. But it's really an interesting paper that looks at the dynamic capabilities that are really being forced as a result of COVID-19. Now, we were all feeling that, but it's worth recognizing that there is a sort of panoply of issues that need to be covered. And just to read from this quote, the COVID-19 pandemic presents a massive challenge to governments worldwide, from the provision of income support to citizens and aid to struggling companies to the strengthening of frontline health services. It also requires an unprecedented level of collaboration between nations, from the race for a vaccine to learning how to test and trace. One of the biggest lessons is that state capacity to manage a crisis of this proportion is dependent on the cumulative investments that the state has made on its ability to govern, do, and manage. While the crisis is serious for all, it's especially a challenge for those that have ignored those needed investments in what we can call dynamic capabilities of the public sector. So what does that mean? Well, dynamic capabilities is really about how we respond. It's really about how we act in a time of crisis, and really about what capabilities do we have to bring to the task. So I would say public entrepreneurs in a time of COVID are rapidly responding to rapidly emerging new priorities, new needs, new vulnerabilities that were not necessarily classed as vulnerabilities before, suddenly have a new classification. Pivoting to online work and digital by default government, so having to very quickly get things online where maybe we were doing things at a slower pace before. Thinking about how to strengthen that social safety net for unstable economic times which have happened immediately, so things like the furlough scheme, but then actually looking into the future and being able to navigate the horizons between the now and the future. Recruiting, although oftentimes what a pandemic like this does is stop recruitment. Teaching and learning digital skills and dynamic capabilities. So if people don't have the skills, I've done some interesting work when the pandemic hit, setting up placements for our MPA students and recognizing that some of our placement hosts were really not familiar with how to use some of this technology, and the placements that we did really forced them to actually engage with a whole new wave of skills. And then also embracing agile procurement and new forms of public-private partnerships, which is no mean feat. And actually, there's been a lot of criticism, I would say, in the UK for not taking an agile procurement approach, but taking, if you like, an emergency procurement approach. And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But that's really about taking executive decisions as opposed to really thinking about how might we derive long-term benefits from how we use procurement now. And all the while remaining alert to new and emergent drivers of change, whether that means, you know, the pandemic changes, or that means that there's a need for different kinds of PPE, or whether that means that we need to think more about lockdown measures that change and are shifting all the time. There is a new level of alert that we need to constantly have. So just for fun, I have categorized the kinds of public entrepreneur who are at play in the in these COVID times. And you know, rather facetiously, I've just given some Marvel superheroes. They obviously have no actual relation to these public entrepreneur types, and full credit to Marvel Studios 2020. But I wanted to sort of, I've put them into these different layers, because I think it's actually quite difficult to understand the sort of, what is it to act entrepreneurially? It can feel like you're acting incredibly entrepreneurially if you're just pivoting to digital, and indeed you probably are. But there is a difference between this kind of, forgive me for calling it exploitation, but the exploitation of the moment, which is that we can derive efficiency gains from and create new workflow innovation and leave behind redundant operating models, because effectively we are in an emergency situation. So it's a drive for efficiency. You can say that there were other great innovations of our time that were also efficiency drivers, and a lot of public sector innovation is very focused on efficiency. So indeed, the first initial efforts of gov.uk in the UK rendered 3.4 billion of public sector savings, 3.4 billion pounds worth of public sector savings. Those savings were derived by an efficiency innovation, which was effectively to consolidate everything into gov.uk and focus on one single user interface. As you move towards an exploratory and long-term value creation paradigm, you necessarily go through the bureaucracy hacker. And the bureaucracy hacker was the first kind of public entrepreneur that I came into contact with, if you like, and that I was aware of in my career when I was working in the public sector. And these are these intrapreneurs, people who are working internally in government, exploring ways that a new normal could create new value. So internally and externally, testing, trying, exploring, experimenting through different kinds of innovation. That might be, understanding, might we look at a business model in a different way here? So coming up with some creative ideas, but those tend to be in isolation and on a problem by problem basis. Moving more extrinsically, or to a more of an external market view or an external world view, the market shaper is very much the kind of the entrepreneurial state, the public innovators who are starting to experiment with ways to shift from passive commissioners or grant makers to active problem solvers and market shapers. And this is where we talk about how to use agile procurement methods or conditionality in procurement, so that you can actually start affecting change or creating markets. And then we have the systems entrepreneur, which is kind of, it may be that this sort of ephemeral and change maker idea, but ultimately the systems entrepreneur is focusing on those global goals, focusing on systemic level challenges such as climate change, and thinking about, as mission-oriented public actors, how might we drive fundamental change through new innovation? So I'm going to have to, because I'm running, I've got about 6 minutes left, I think, according to my timer. I'm going to run relatively fast through these, so you can have a look at the slides thereafter. But effectively, it's worth recognizing that there is value in all of these. There is no kind of Dr. Evil in these public entrepreneur types. Being able to start building efficiency measures and into your daily work can do no harm. Fundamentally, it does require that a sort of use of agile adaptive methods, design thinking, and working in online environments. And it's a frugal innovation approach, effectively moving fast and fixing things. The bureaucracy hacker is the key points that I'm very keen to put forward is that a bureaucracy hacker might be a particular type of mindset. So you might find that it's a particular type of extremely confident entrepreneurial individual. And I think anyone can be a bureaucracy hacker, but it does require a bit of curiosity, agility, and bravery to be able to navigate bureaucracy and political networks. You need to want to do it, to nudge changes, to open doors and find new ways of doing things. Ways of thinking about hacking as dynamic capabilities is that actually we really all need to be a little bit more of a bureaucracy hacker. Not everyone has to be a disruptive innovator, but we do all need to be starting to think about, how do we experiment with agile approaches at a team level? How do we think about learn fast rather than fail fast environments. And I think it's very important to note, I'm not an advocate of kind of copying and pasting a Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship into a public sector environment. That wouldn't work. You need to ensure that you're focusing on good governance. So as opposed to fail fast, it's really about safe fail that I'm suggesting that you work with. And a key way of doing this is to really mix up your teams. Something that I did in the lab before at the RSA was focus on always having a rookie on the team. There should always be a focus on learning. The limitations of this is that real innovations are those that alter core tasks, and bureaucracy hacks add to or alter peripheral tasks. So the question you should always ask yourself when you're being a bureaucracy hacker is, am I changing this wider system, or am I improving it here, and there may be a sort of externality over there that isn't really fundamentally changing organizational culture? There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm running out of time, but the public entrepreneur type 3 is this concept of a market shaper. And this is Mariana's entrepreneurial state logic, which is that public actors are part of a complex system that creates markets. So they work together, the state, businesses, and civil society all work together, and growth should not just have a rate, but also a direction. And that means that building symbiotic ecosystems is part of the lexicon of the public actor. Now, the big challenge that you have in most instances around the world is that your regulatory frameworks do not help you with this, because most instances, competition law and various other regulatory environments will prevent you from explicitly market shaping because of market impacts and the impacts on competition. So we are doing a lot of work on trying to understand and experiment with regulatory environments that allow market shaping to be part of the lexicon of the public entrepreneur, which means that you get away from this binary that the public sector is bureaucracy and is only focusing on risk, and the private sector is all about the creativity of ideas, and seeing that it's actually a lot more of a joined up piece. It requires financial regulations, it requires industrial and innovation policy, it requires that you do conditionality in public procurement, and it also requires that there's a sort of problem solving mindset through investment agencies, all of which is not an easy task. And I will finish with the concept of the systems entrepreneur, the public entrepreneur type 4. Now, this is this brings the concept of systems change into the, legitimately into the discourse within public sector innovation. And I think that sometimes it sits outside, it sits with the third sector, it sits with civil society, but really it's about understanding that everything that is happening within public sector is part of this wider system of change. And so are we serving a new story that thinks to issues of climate change, or speaks to issues of climate change, speaks to issues of inequality, speaks to those other issues that feature in the SDGs? Broadly speaking, this means not just thinking as if you were a single part of a system or not an individual part of a complex system, but actually a systems entrepreneur is really seeing themselves as quite a hub or a host, or has the convening power to facilitate change to an entire ecosystem. And in many instances, government doesn't recognize its own agency or its capacity to be that host or that convener. And that's something that systems entrepreneurs start to try and change. I will go past this, but broadly speaking, systems innovation is about understanding beyond the micro. So the activity level, the user insights, the individual activity, beyond the meso, which is the what institution you work in, what is the business model you're working in, what is the the activity around that, and into that systemic change, the bigger picture, the dominant narratives, the aspirational narratives, the regulatory and legal regimes. So that's a lot to take into account, and you don't have to be all of those things, and they do require a certain level of superhero capacity to actually deliver on all of those things. I've not met a single individual who is addressing all of those ways of being, but I think that it's useful to understand that there are different approaches to being a public entrepreneur, that innovation can happen in a variety of ways, and effectively it's worth playing with some of this. So I would say, to affect change and find solutions to the very many challenges thrown up by the pandemic, it's important to focus on, are you working in an adaptive way? Can you have the confidence of an entrepreneur, but also the competence of a public servant? It's very hard to work like this. It's really important to recognize it's very hard to work like this, because I think you're often coming up against what I've called in the past the system immune response. You are coming up against statutory responsibilities, real, genuinely strong cultures of risk aversion in many instances, and regulatory environments and policies that may not align with your goals. So the ways to counter this, you could just give up, because it could be very frustrating, and you take a lot of the burden as individual practitioners. But to counter this, explore, experiment, and engage widely. Keep talking, broaden your network. And COVID offers an unprecedented opportunity to turn this entrepreneurial mindset to public well-being, toward inclusive growth, toward global challenges, which broadens the entrepreneurial story beyond that private sector startup and into this more complex ecosystem of change. So what I'm leaving you with is that public entrepreneurs are not on this traditional entrepreneurial journey, which starts with kind of an idea and then navigates around this funding gap and the valley of death, and then becomes this, we are a unicorn and everything is successful as a business. But you are, in COVID, navigating a challenging journey. And I think it's worth having a look at the work that Alex Evan does in the Collective Psychology Project, because you can't just come into this with the confidence and competence of a public entrepreneur. You also have to take into account that we are in a dynamic, changing, effectively disaster scenario. This is the phases of disaster, and we will continue to navigate these pathways where a lot of stuff is going on while we are trying to be entrepreneurial. So we are being adaptive in unstable times. So I wish you the best of luck in your work. Your work is important, and I think that it is hopefully a little bit useful for you to think through, how am I showing up? Where am I being a public entrepreneur? And giving yourself a pat on the back for when you are. So thank you very much.